High-security prisons, often called supermax or maximum security prisons, are correctional facilities designed to house the most dangerous and disruptive inmates under the most restrictive conditions possible. These facilities focus primarily on isolation, control, and surveillance rather than rehabilitation. They emerged as a response to rising levels of violent crime, prison riots, and organized criminal networks, which traditional prison structures could no longer contain. The earliest forms of high-security incarceration can be traced to ancient civilizations such as Mesopotamia and Egypt, where prison cells were used more for holding than reforming. During the Middle Ages, dungeons beneath castles served similar roles, primarily as temporary holding spaces or places of punishment. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries that the modern concept of incarceration as punishment began to evolve, with more structured prison systems appearing in Europe and North America. In early modern America, the Pennsylvania system and Auburn system introduced solitary confinement as a method of moral reform. These concepts laid the foundation for what would eventually become the supermax model. However, isolation techniques in those early systems often led to psychological deterioration among inmates, foreshadowing the modern criticisms of such confinement. By the 20th century, the rise of organized crime, drug cartels, and gang culture necessitated new levels of prison control. Authorities began constructing purpose-built high-security institutions to manage inmates who posed ongoing threats even behind bars. These included escape artists, gang leaders, terrorists, and those with histories of violence toward other inmates, or prison staff. The term supermax prison gained traction in the United States in the late 1980s, particularly with the opening of the ADX Florence facility in Colorado in 1994, often referred to as the most secure prison in the U.S. ADX Florence, nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies, introduced a new era of incarceration where inmates spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement under constant surveillance, with little to no contact with other human beings. Globally, similar trends began to emerge. Countries like Russia built infamous high-security facilities like the Black Dolphin Prison, where inmates are hooded, shackled, and never allowed to see the outside world. In China, political dissidents and criminals alike are confined in tiger cages under the country's high-security penal system. Even democratic nations like the UK and Australia have constructed units within prisons that mirror the extreme control measures of American supermax prisons. This global expansion of high-security incarceration has been largely driven by the international war on drugs, the rise of transnational crime syndicates, the need to detain terrorists securely, the challenges of internal prison gang control. Although these facilities are seen by governments as tools to maintain law and order, they are frequently criticized for human rights violations, particularly regarding psychological effects on inmates, lack of due process, and indefinite solitary confinement. Thus, when CECOT, Centro de Confinamiento del Terrorismo, was introduced in El Salvador in 2023, it did not emerge in a vacuum. It was the latest iteration in a long historical trajectory of high-security incarceration, a culmination of centuries of penal evolution, driven by the ongoing tension between security, control, and civil liberties. To understand the emergence of CECOT, we must trace the origins of El Salvador's gang crisis, which is not merely a domestic issue, but one with deep international and historical roots. Following a brutal 12-year civil war in El Salvador, 1980-1992, the nation was left fractured, impoverished, and politically unstable. The war killed over 75,000 people and displaced hundreds of thousands. Many Salvadorans fled to the United States, especially to Los Angeles, where Salvadoran youth found themselves navigating life in marginalized, impoverished neighborhoods with little support. It was in these U.S. urban ghettos that the seeds of El Salvador's gang problem were planted. Salvadoran immigrants formed gangs to protect themselves from existing African American and Mexican American gangs. Two of the most infamous, MS-13, Mara Salvatrucha, and Barrio 18, 18th Street Gang, originated during this diaspora, not in El Salvador itself. These gangs were American creations, forged in the concrete jungles of Los Angeles, but eventually exported back to El Salvador. In the mid-1990s, as part of the U.S.'s tough-on-crime policies, thousands of gang members were deported back to Central America. These deportees returned to a country with fragile institutions, rampant poverty, and few social services, a perfect environment for gangs to flourish. Once back in El Salvador, MS-13 and Barrio 18 transplanted their criminal models, turning neighborhoods into territories and imposing their own brutal systems of taxation, la renta, punishment, and control. They recruited heavily among impoverished youth, often offering the only sense of identity or protection in a society offering little else. By the early 2000s, El Salvador had become one of the most violent countries in the world, with homicide rates soaring past 100 per 100,000 residents. Entire communities were paralyzed by extortion, kidnappings, forced disappearances, and executions. School attendance dropped in gang-controlled zones. Bus drivers were regularly murdered for refusing to pay extortion fees. Women were often targets of sexual violence and forced relationships with gang members. The government's initial responses were largely reactive and ineffective. Policies such as Mano Dura, Iron Fist, first launched in 2003, attempted to arrest and incarcerate large numbers of suspected gang members. However, these crackdowns often lacked proper legal oversight, filled prisons to capacity, and paradoxically strengthened the gangs, who used prison time to organize and solidify their structures. By the 2010s, prisons in El Salvador had become gang headquarters rather than deterrents. MS-13 and Barrio 18 had their own wings in jails. Orders for extortion, murders, and drug movements were issued from inside cell blocks. The state's penal system had essentially ceded control to the very groups it sought to suppress. El Salvador's key governments over the decades swung between hardline crackdowns and controversial negotiations with gangs, both strategies failing to bring long-term peace. Truce of 2012. Under President Mauricio Funes, the government brokered a secret truce between MS-13 and Barrio 18. This led to a dramatic but temporary drop in homicide rates. However, the truce fell apart by 2014, and violence rebounded. Backlash and distrust. Public backlash against the truce was intense. Many Salvadorans viewed it as a capitulation to criminals. When the truce failed, gangs retaliated more violently, targeting police officers, military personnel, and civilians. By the time President Nayib Bukele took office in 2019, El Salvador was deeply traumatized by gang violence. Bukele promised a new strategy, one that would be swift, unrelenting, and, above all, unapologetic. His rise marked a break from traditional politics, and his approach to the gang crisis would culminate in the creation of CECOT, a facility unlike anything the country had ever seen. But before CECOT, Bukele launched his now famous state of exception in March 2022 after a gang-led massacre killed over 60 people in one weekend. The state of exception suspended key constitutional rights, freedom of assembly, legal defense, and judicial oversight. In less than a year, over 70,000 people were arrested. While the move received broad public support, human rights groups warned of mass detentions without due process, reports of torture, and the incarceration of innocent civilians. Despite this, the government doubled down, and public confidence in Bukele soared. Most Salvadorans felt that for the first time in decades, the streets were safe, but mass arrests presented a logistical problem: where to put all the detainees. The existing prisons were already overcrowded. Thus, the government unveiled its answer: the Centro de Confinamiento del Terrorismo, CECOT, a facility purpose-built to house tens of thousands of gang members under the strictest possible conditions. This development didn't just arise from a need for space. It was symbolic, a public declaration that the Salvadoran state was taking back control from the gangs. When Nayib Bukele assumed the presidency of El Salvador in 2019, he presented himself as a political outsider, a millennial reformer who would challenge both the traditional right and left-wing parties. Bukele inherited a country plagued by chronic violence, institutional corruption, and widespread public fear of gangs like MS-13 and Barrio 18. With over 100,000 active gang members in a country of just 6.5 million people, and many of them still operating from within the country's overrun prisons, Bukele understood that the usual tactics had failed. His government implemented a radical shift, an iron-fisted militarized strategy to eradicate gang influence at all levels of Salvadoran society. The pivotal moment came in March 2022, when more than 60 civilians were murdered in a single weekend. One of the deadliest crime waves in the country's history. In response, Bukele declared a state of exception, which granted police and military forces emergency powers, including the ability to arrest without a warrant, detain without timely judicial review, and monitor private communications. This declaration was repeatedly renewed and became the legal backbone for a sweeping crackdown on gang activity. Over the next year, more than 85,000 individuals were arrested, many of whom were suspected gang members or affiliates. These arrests, however, created a new logistical crisis. The Salvadoran prison system was collapsing under its own weight. Cells designed for 50 inmates held over 150. There was nowhere to house the detained population, and worse, prison gangs still exerted a level of control behind bars. Bukele responded with a project as ambitious as it was controversial: the construction of CECOT, Centro de Confinamiento del Terrorismo, or the Terrorism Confinement Center. This mega prison was not just a facility, it was a symbolic and physical expression of Bukele's governance, uncompromising, showy, and intended to strike fear into the criminal underworld. It also aimed to reassure Salvadorans that justice was being served, harshly and swiftly. In January 2023, Bukele inaugurated CECOT with theatrical flair. Government cameras followed the transfer of the first 2,000 prisoners, many of them shirtless, barefoot, and shackled. They were paraded through the night, heads bowed, under the scrutiny of heavily armed guards and surveillance drones. The footage was released online and quickly went viral, drawing both praise and condemnation from around the world. Located in Tecoluca, about 74 kilometers southeast of San Salvador, CECOT is one of the largest and most secure prisons in the world. It was constructed in a record time of 7 months, surrounded by a 23-foot-high perimeter wall, reinforced with electric fencing, motion detectors, and hundreds of surveillance cameras. The complex spans 166 hectares, over 410 acres, and is designed to hold up to 40,000 inmates, many of them for life. Maximum isolation. Inmates are cut off entirely from the outside world. No visitors, no phone calls, no internet. No rehabilitation programs, surveillance and control. Every movement is monitored by high-definition cameras and motion sensors. Facial recognition systems log each prisoner's identity and location. Military-grade security. Over 600 soldiers and 250 police officers guard the perimeter. Entry and exit are tightly controlled. Cell conditions. Cells have no windows and are constantly lit to prevent any sense of day or night. Beds are concrete slabs. Toilets are communal, and water access is restricted. No classification system. Unlike in most prison systems where inmates are sorted by age, crime, or behavior, CECOT houses everyone together, creating a harsh psychological environment with no social hierarchy and no opportunity for escape or gang control. The official narrative is clear. CECOT is not a correctional facility, it is a containment unit. Bukele has openly stated that these gang members gave up their rights when they terrorized the nation. His approach deliberately rejects the rehabilitative model of justice in favor of retributive punishment. This extreme posture has drawn support from many Salvadorans who view the crackdown in prison as a necessary evil. Crime has reportedly dropped dramatically since the implementation of the state of exception and the opening of CECOT. Extortion rates, homicides, and gang-related crimes have fallen to historic lows. For the average Salvadoran, fear has receded, at least for now. However, critics warn that this new peace is built on shaky constitutional ground. Human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have condemned CECOT, calling it a mass violation of due process and dignity. Reports from inside suggest that innocent people, including minors, have been caught in the dragnet. There is no access to legal counsel for many prisoners. Families often don't know where their relatives are held. There are allegations of torture, beatings, starvation, and psychological abuse. Even so, Bukele's government remains unapologetic. It has positioned CECOT not only as the cornerstone of its security strategy, but as a model for the region, an exportable solution to Latin America's endemic gang problems. The construction and operation of CECOT, Centro de Confinamiento del Terrorismo, has sparked international alarm, particularly among human rights organizations, legal scholars, and global watchdog groups. From the very beginning, CECOT has been condemned as a symbol of authoritarian justice, where legal norms are subordinated to brute force. Groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations Human Rights Office have issued strong criticisms, warning that El Salvador is engaging in systematic human rights violations. Chief among their concerns are the following: arbitrary detentions. Under the state of exception, thousands have been arrested without warrants, based solely on appearance, tattoos, or anonymous tips. The right to legal defense has been suspended for many detainees, and habeas corpus rights have been limited or ignored. Torture and inhumane conditions. Reports have surfaced of beatings, solitary confinement, sleep deprivation, and the denial of medical care. Former detainees and prison guards have anonymously described dehumanizing routines designed to break the spirit of inmates. Lack of transparency. Family members are often not informed of the whereabouts of arrested individuals. Prisoners are moved without notice. Legal representation is denied or delayed, and journalists have little access to verify conditions inside. Mass trials. In 2024, the Salvadoran government introduced plans to hold mass trials, grouping thousands of detainees together in judicial proceedings. Legal experts warn this violates the presumption of innocence and erodes the right to individual defense. Despite these criticisms, Bukele's administration remains defiant. Officials have argued that international standards do not apply in a context where gangs have operated like domestic terrorist groups, murdering civilians, controlling territory, and imposing their own laws. CECOT and Bukele's overall crackdown have inspired divided reactions across Latin America. Some leaders, particularly in countries overwhelmed by gang violence like Honduras, Guatemala, Ecuador, and Mexico, have publicly expressed interest in replicating El Salvador's model. In fact, Honduras declared its own state of exception in 2023 and began mass arrests of gang members, mimicking Bukele's rhetoric and methods. Ecuador, grappling with cartel-related violence, has also moved toward a more militarized security strategy. In these contexts, CECOT is seen as a symbol of resolve, a signal that the state can strike back against organized crime. However, others see Bukele's approach as a dangerous overreach, where short-term peace comes at the cost of democratic institutions. Regional leaders from Chile, Colombia, and Costa Rica have warned against eroding civil liberties in the name of security. They argue that authoritarian methods can easily metastasize into broader oppression. The broader global concern is this: will CECOT set a precedent where authoritarianism is normalized under the guise of public safety? And will other nations, under pressure from their own citizens, choose fear over freedom? CECOT is not simply a prison. It is a total surveillance environment, a meticulously engineered structure designed to eliminate escape, suppress resistance, and control every dimension of an inmate's existence. Location and size. Situated in Tecoluca, the prison is geographically isolated, minimizing the risk of rescue attempts or outside communication. It spans 166 hectares, making it the largest prison in the Americas. Perimeter and defenses. The outer walls stand 23 feet tall, reinforced with electrified fencing, security towers, motion detectors, and drone surveillance. Entry is limited to a single reinforced checkpoint. Staffing. More than 850 military and police personnel provide 24/7 security. Staff undergo rigorous psychological vetting and are rotated frequently to prevent internal corruption. CCTV cameras. More than 500 cameras cover every angle, including cells, corridors, and recreational areas. Biometric tracking. Prisoners are tagged with digital IDs. Facial recognition systems log their movements. AI monitoring. Automated systems detect unusual behavior, fights, gatherings, or signs of unrest. CECOT is designed to allow zero opportunity for gang leadership to re-emerge. In most Latin American prisons, gangs operate internally, sometimes with the same power they had on the outside. But at CECOT, the constant rotation of prisoners, the banning of communication, and the absence of privileges create an environment in which no hierarchy can be built. Life inside CECOT is deliberately designed to be as punishing as possible, not just physically, but psychologically. Prisoners are kept in cells with no windows, under constant fluorescent lighting, which erodes their sense of time. They sleep on concrete slabs, share open toilets, and are denied any personal items. Meals are delivered through small slots in the cell door. No visitors, no phone calls, and no letters are permitted. Showers are rare and monitored. Exercise is restricted to brief, heavily supervised sessions. Inmates are not allowed to speak to each other. Guards punish verbal communication with isolation or beatings. There is no music, no books, no television. Religious services are banned. There is nothing to engage the mind or soul. The cells are designed to prevent self-harm, yet suicides and breakdowns are reportedly increasing. Former prison wardens who have analyzed CECOT describe it as a machine for breaking human beings. In psychological terms, the environment induces sensory deprivation, learned helplessness, and identity erosion. Some prisoners have reportedly renounced gang membership simply to seek better conditions, though such claims are difficult to verify. Others have attempted to communicate messages to the outside world through smuggled notes or gestures during court appearances, but surveillance remains nearly total. The Salvadoran government, for its part, insists that CECOT is working. With gangs decapitated and their command structures destroyed, street-level crime has plummeted. But at what cost? Since the launch of the state of exception in March 2022 and the subsequent activation of CECOT, El Salvador has witnessed a stunning drop in violent crime. Once considered one of the most dangerous countries in the world, El Salvador's transformation has been so dramatic that it has been called the miracle of Central America. Homicide rate. El Salvador's murder rate dropped from 52 per 100,000 people in 2018 to less than 8 per 100,000 in 2023, making it one of the lowest in Latin America. Extortion, a major source of gang revenue, has plummeted by over 90%. Small business owners and street vendors now operate without the fear of daily shakedowns. Gang presence. Entire neighborhoods that were once under gang control have been reclaimed. No-go zones have become accessible again, and local commerce has restarted. Public perception. Surveys indicate that over 85% of Salvadorans support Bukele's policies, with many describing a sense of peace they have never before experienced. Bukele's government has seized on these statistics as proof of concept. For the first time in decades, people are walking freely in the streets at night. Children can attend schools in former war zones, and the national economy has started to rebound thanks to reduced criminal interference. International tourism, once virtually non-existent, is beginning to return. Surf tourism in particular has flourished on El Salvador's Pacific coast. The government is branding the nation as the new El Salvador, a country reborn from chaos. But behind this renaissance lies a more complex social story. While many Salvadorans rejoice in the apparent peace, a growing segment of society is living in silence and fear, not of gangs, but of the state. Wrongful arrests. Thousands of innocent people, many young men from poor neighborhoods, have been swept up in the anti-gang dragnet. Simply having tattoos, being in a certain area, or being denounced by an anonymous source has led to imprisonment. Disappeared. Detainees. Human rights groups report that over 2,200 detainees remain unaccounted for, with families unsure whether their loved ones are alive, dead, or held indefinitely. Deaths in custody. As of 2024, at least 190 people have died in custody, many under suspicious circumstances involving beatings, lack of medical attention, or suicide. Broken families. Wives, mothers, and children wait in line at prisons every day, trying to deliver clothes or food, often denied entry or information. Their voices are rarely heard in the national discourse, journalism, and criticism. Critical journalists have been harassed, surveilled, or forced into exile. Few dare to investigate what happens inside CECOT or speak openly about its abuses. Legal. System under pressure. Judges have been dismissed, prosecutors pressured, and defense lawyers intimidated. Many courts now operate as extensions of state power, rather than independent institutions. In short, while street-level safety has improved, the legal and moral foundation of Salvadoran justice is eroding. The question remains, can peace built on repression endure? The success of CECOT in neutralizing gangs has made it a political export product. Leaders across Latin America and the global South are watching closely. Countries like Honduras, Ecuador, and even Argentina have begun to explore Bukele-style crackdowns. Some are calling for the construction of similar mega-prisons. Others are borrowing Bukele's messaging, equating human rights advocacy with weakness, and treating security as a battlefield, not a civic duty. But the CECOT model raises global alarms. Legal scholars warn that the normalization of mass imprisonment, suspension of rights, and military policing could destabilize democracies across the region. If such a model is adopted without checks, the result may be regional autocracies where order replaces justice, but only for a time. The question is not whether Bukele has reduced crime. He has, but at what cost, and for how long? While gang leadership has been decimated, many analysts caution that this may be a temporary suppression, not a permanent eradication. Prisons like CECOT create conditions that breed radicalization, not rehabilitation, erode legal norms, weakening the state's legitimacy, offer no path for reintegration, ensuring future societal friction. Furthermore, the very nature of Bukele's power, the reliance on military force, the dismantling of opposition, the control of the judiciary and legislature, raises fears of a return to authoritarianism in El Salvador. If political transitions occur or power is challenged, the same machinery used to imprison gang members could be turned against activists, journalists, or opposition leaders. In this light, CECOT may be less a prison than a mirror, reflecting both the hopes and dangers of a nation desperate for peace. CECOT is perhaps the most visibly extreme symbol of the global tension between freedom and control, safety and rights. It represents a turning point not only in Salvadoran history, but also in how nations might choose to combat deeply rooted criminal networks. For now, El Salvador has silenced the guns. But can peace last when bought at the price of law? That is the enduring question.